Hello, everybody. So now we're going to talk about brain development in the first few months of life. So the changes in the brain are actually responsible for many of the developmental changes we will cover in this chapter. And as we know from chapter 3, fetuses already have basic sensory and motor capacities even before birth. We're going to look at how that continues to develop after birth. And a lot of that stems from the brain development. So what we'll look at here is neurons and networks of neurons, central nervous system, and then the role of experience in brain development. So our first stop is neurons and networks of neurons. So the brain is an enormous, complex communication system of neuron networks. At birth, there are around 100 billion neurons in the brain. And this is a vast majority of all the neurons it will ever have actually at birth. Later, we'll talk about something called synaptic pruning. But what is a neuron? It's a nerve cell that transmits information. And how do they transmit information? We can look at like a two-step process. So they send information along what we call the axon. And this is a branch that reaches out to connect with other brain cells. So it's sending information through electrical impulses along this axon, and it's receiving information from axons of other cells through dendrites. So in this image here, the dendrites would be these little tree-like extensions, little branched extensions at the end. And then the axon would be this long portion in the middle here. So it's a communication system with both sending and receiving neurons. And we also want to talk about a synapse. So what is that? So a synapse is a tiny gap between axons and dendrites of communicating neurons. So it's kind of getting into that communication system and how it works. And we also have neurotransmitters involved. So neurotransmitters are the things that carry impulses from the sending neuron to the receiving neuron across that synaptic gap. So those were the very stripped down basics. There is a lot more detail to it, but for this class, that's all we're really going to go over. But that leads us into how does this even relate to baby's brain growth? So there is a remarkable amount of growth that's occurring in the brain size during infancy, which is credited to two parts of neuron networks, gray matter and white matter. So we see an increased size and complexity of gray matter and white matter in infancy. In terms of gray matter, we have the dendrites developing new branches and the axons becoming longer in infancy. This results in something called synaptogenesis. So this is simply a fancy word for the formation of new synapses. And then we have, we want to hold on to that term for later. We'll come back. But then we have white matter, which includes something called myelin, which maybe rings a bell from when we first learned about this stuff in maybe high school science classes. But myelin, as a recap, is an insulating material that forms a cover around the axons. And what is its purpose? It actually speeds the transfer of information between neurons. They actually can speed it up to 100 times faster. So we're seeing more white matter, especially myelin, in infancy, which also accounts for this rapid brain growth that we see. So this increase in gray and white matter producing synaptogenesis and myelin. Now, what about the central nervous system? So this is divided into three major sections: the spinal cord, the brainstem, and the cerebral cortex. Let's walk through them. So the spinal cord, it's like a tube-like bundle of nerves. It extends from the base of the brain to below the waist. So it's the first image here would be an example of the spinal cord and how it looks. And the nerves of the spinal cord carry messages from the brain to the spinal nerves. So it's communicating with specific areas of the body. That's kind of its function. Next, we have the brainstem. So the brainstem is growing out of the top of the spinal cord, like the image, second image here. And it controls vital functions like breathing, sleeping, even elementary reactions like reflexive blinking or reflexive sucking. So it's I also want to point out it's one of the most highly developed areas of the central nervous system at birth. And lastly, we have the cerebral cortex. Now this is the brain's outermost layer. It's the most complex system here. And what it is, it's the processing center for lots of things like planning, decision-making, speech and language, perceiving patterns, executing motor sequences. It's a lot of different types of processing. And we have an image of it here, kind of split into different lobes. So that actually leads me to the next slide to go into more detail. So cerebral cortex is divided into first 2 hemispheres, and then each is divided into 4 lobes. And again, this might be a recap to some of us, but the 4 lobes are occipital, which is specialized for vision. We have the temporal lobes. These are specialized for hearing and speech. The parietal lobe, specialized for spatial perception, and the frontal lobes, specialized for complex forms of behavior and thought. Now, these are stripped down summaries of them. I actually want to show a video that goes into a little more detail because there is more to it than just these things, but these are kind of the things that you want to know, just the more general specializations of each lobe. But I also want to make sure we get a fuller look at it. So let's go ahead and watch this very short video.
Welcome back to our lesson on the nervous system. In this video, we will focus on the basic structure of the brain, in particular, the cerebral cortex. We will introduce the 4 lobes of the cortex, as well as their functions. Great, so let's begin. When we look at the brain, the outermost layer that we observe is called the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is made up of gray matter that is folded and wrinkled. The surface of the cerebral cortex is divided into 4 lobes, which each serve their own purpose. The lobes of the cortex are separated by deep grooves called fissures. One example of a fissure is called the longitudinal fissure, which divides the cortex into right and left hemispheres. The first lobe that we will cover is the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is located behind the forehead, and it can be found towards the top front section of the brain. This section of the brain is responsible for rational thought and decision-making. It is also responsible for our emotions and personality. In addition, it contains the Broca's area, which is responsible for producing spoken language. The parietal lobe is separated from the frontal lobe by the central gyrus fissure and can be found towards the top of the skull. The parietal lobe is responsible for somatosensory information such as touch, temperature, and pain. It is also responsible for our spatial sense and proprioception. Next is the temporal lobe, which is located just above the ear under the temporal bone. The left temporal lobe houses the Wernicke's area, which plays a part in language comprehension, particularly with the interpretation and comprehension of speech. The temporal lobe is also responsible for hearing through the auditory cortex and smell through the olfactory cortex. The last of the 4 lobes is the occipital lobe. It is located at the back of the head, under the occipital bone. This lobe houses the visual cortex and is the visual association area that allows us to distinguish color, shape, and motion. This concludes our discussion on the lobes of the cerebrum. Thank you for
Right. So that was an overview of the lobes in the cerebral cortex. So that was a lot more detail than anything that might show up on a test, but these are kind of the things that you would want to know, just the general functions of what they're specialized for. Some little tricks from when I was in school. Occipital, I kind of associated that with the letter O. It starts with an O, and it's associated with vision, right? And an optometrist is a doctor of vision and, eyes. So I kind of associated that way, the O, optometrist, occipital. And then for temporal, it's associated with hearing and speech. And it's actually located kind of closer to your temples. So and temples are close to your ears, right? So that's one of the associations I used to make in school to remember this. The other 2 I don't really have tricks for, but maybe that helps you a little, those tricks. So this is where we're going to stop this video. But next we're going to talk about the role of experience in brain development. So thank you for joining, everyone, and I will see you there.